Truman National Security Project and a fellow of the American Civic Leadership Institute. She has been an advocate in the American Muslim community on the grassroots level for many years, working hard to correct misconceptions and build interfaith relationships. And without further ado, I'd like to call Rabia to the stage.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. So logistically I'm going to be working over here, but if for some reason you can't hear me, just let me know. I generally have a big voice. So I'm really excited to talk about this, and this is the first time I'm publicly speaking about this experience. I'm going to first tell you a little bit about my background going into this, why I decided to do it, and then what this program was, because I was actually part of a program. I did not go independently. So I am from a Pakistani-American family. My parents migrated here in the 70s, like a lot of people, and when they arrived in this country, they had certain ideas about Jews, about Israel, that are typical to be expected from somebody who's going to be raised in Pakistan. What was interesting was that when my parents first arrived, their entire journey to the United States was very strongly an interfaith journey. My father's best friend was a Pakistani Christian, and he is the one who sponsored my family to come here. When my father first arrived to the United States, he was a veterinary doctor, but like a lot of people, he couldn't get jobs in his profession. He was working in security, he was working as a bank teller. He got his first job as a veterinarian through an elderly gentleman in Potomac, Maryland, who was a Jewish doctor who was ready to retire. And he was so excited to hear about my father's background and the fact that he was looking for this kind of work. And then he knew he had a wife and a young daughter, that was me, who were living in a cramped little apartment in Virginia. He said, you know what, I'm going to turn my practice over to you, and I'm going to give you the house that's right next door, which is my own house. And I want you to bring your wife and daughter here. And so that was my dad's first break in his own profession in the United States. So growing up, and I at the time was maybe a year old, so that was my parents' first experience ever with a Jewish person, ever, in person. And so growing up, I can absolutely say that there was actually never any anti-Semitism in my home. That's not easy to say for a lot of Muslim families, okay? I'm not saying that my parents were not very cognizant of what was happening in Palestine and Israel. We were always made aware of the events in the Middle East. But my parents always were very clear that, this is what's happening is a political conflict, but we have known Jews, and Jews are good people. So I always had this framework, so I never was uncomfortable, but in my own early years as an activist, while I was still in law school and in college, I did join Palestinian resistance movements in the United States. I joined an organization called Al-Awda, which is a Palestinian right to return organization, which was interestingly enough headed by an Israeli Jewish person and a Palestinian Christian man. So, I very much, the framework for me was, I'm anti-Zionist, but I'm not anti-Semitic. It was easy for me to make that distinction. Now, as time passed, I grew up, 9/11 happened, other things happened. The relevance of that conflict, unfortunately, became less and less. And like most of the Muslim community, you still keep the Palestinians in your prayers, you keep people who are oppressed all over the world in your prayers, but it no longer became a focal point for my activism. It just became a part of my prayers. So about a year ago, I was asked to join a program. Now, the thing about this program is that we cannot be publicly talking about the individuals who were involved or the actual institutions that were involved. And a couple of reasons that. Number one, security. Number two, politically, it was very difficult for all of the participants to say yes to this, and for the institutions involved to say yes to this. And third, because it could really undermine the credibility of people who are trying to do this work. So I'll explain why. An Israeli institution that was an educational institution, purely educational, was working with an American Muslim leader, I'm not going to say who it was, and said to him, we have a program where we bring, like a lot of different institutions, we bring, groups of Christian leaders and youth and stuff to the Holy Land, and we teach them Judaism. We teach them about Israel, we teach them Judaism. Do you think there would be an interest among Muslim leaders in America? And so this particular leader who had a good contact, a friend of his worked at the Institute, said, I can check, but I don't know. It would be a really hard sell, So he began reaching out to his network, and I was part of that network. And he reached out to me and said, Rabia, would you be interested in going to Israel for 2 weeks this summer, sponsored by an Israeli educational institute, not a political entity, but an educational institute, to learn Judaism. Now, I have never been in the Middle East at all, and politically, this was very difficult for me to even reconcile. I'm going to be sponsored by an Israeli institute, right? Even though they don't represent the government, it's an Israeli institute to learn Judaism. So I spent at least 2 months talking to people, and I learned who some of the other people were who were invited. We had discussions together. We even contacted some clerics, like Habib Umar. I don't know if anybody's aware of who Habib Umar Jafar is. He's a very well-known, respected sheikh from Yemen. So we consulted even religious scholars about should we do this or not, you know? Because this entire group was about 25 of us were like kind of young Muslim leaders from lots of different backgrounds. And across the board, everybody we consulted said, yeah, you should do it. Do it. It's an experience, and you're going to learn Judaism. A lot of us do interfaith work, but our interfaith work is usually, let me tell you about Islam, right? Like that's usually our interfaith work. So I thought this was an opportunity for me to learn about my Abrahamic roots. Okay? So we, in the end of May, early June of this year, we traveled to Jerusalem together. We arrived, and by the way, every image you see are photographs I've taken myself, including this. This is a picture of a poster that I found in the Old City. Okay? We arrived in Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport. Is that better? Okay. So we arrived in Tel Aviv at the Ben Gurion Airport. Most of us coming directly from the United States. Some of us traveling through Turkey and different places. Actually, we stopped in Turkey too. So from there, we had to travel to Jerusalem by bus. It took us about 2 hours to do that. And we were just exhausted. We were exhausted, but for most of us, we were so excited that we were going to be in Jerusalem. You know, Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock. So what happened was, I mean, first of all, I had like 500 photographs, and I had to quickly select about my favorite 30 or 40 to share with you. So we drove into Jerusalem, and I don't even to this day know enough about the layout of the city. I mean, our 2 weeks there were incredibly packed with studies. We were studying from 9 a.m. to like 9 p.m., and we had a few hours in the middle of the day to explore. But what I understood was that the way Jerusalem worked was there was the old city, which had a gate around it, a wall around it, and you can see that's part of the wall right there. This is called, I believe, the Tower of David, but that's a photograph from a distance. But we were staying in kind of the newer portion of Jerusalem, okay? It's in a lower level, and you have to walk up to the old city. So this was from the back of the group of us. And one thing I noticed immediately was how incredibly beautiful, really stunningly beautiful Israel is. Jerusalem is. All of these places were just, look at this, perfectly manicured, beautiful. Now what looks here like to be, you know, I don't know, centuries old, you know, these are relatively new structures, but they've kept the flavor of Jerusalem so that it all looks like it's millennia old. What's interesting, so as soon as we arrived there, our host said, well, it was a Sunday, it was around noon, and they said, you know what, your classes start today at 5 o'clock. We know you've been traveling for 20 hours, but we start studying tonight. So you can either rest or you can go to the old city. And all of us said, we're going to Aqsa, we're going to go to the Dome. It was really hot, by the way. We're talking about 105, 103. I mean, it was really sweltering temperature. So we made our way up. And this is a picture of some of us through the bazaar. See, Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock are inside a compound, which is surrounded by a labyrinth of bazaars, and it has 3 or 4 gates that can lead from any of those bazaars into where those 2 masajid are. So as we went through these alleys, we emerged through one of the gates, and that was my first glimpse of the Dome of the Rock, right there. this is a stairway that leads up into that compound. I'm sorry, you can't see it very well because of the lighting and stuff. It might, well, it's fine. So yeah, as you emerge out, you're immediately into the compound. It's a very large area. You can't see it here, but you cannot get past this point unless you go through a checkpoint. There are IDF soldiers, right, Israeli soldiers that sit there and they make sure that you are Muslim before you go in. I was asked to recite Fatiha, and yeah, I mean I wear hijab and everything, but I was asked to prove that I'm a Muslim before they would let us in. And these are IDF soldiers, but I believe many of them are all often Druze, and that's a whole different section of society that we don't often hear about. But you know, they want to make sure that due to sensitivities of the Muslims in the area, that they don't want to let people in who might be a threat to the compound, and also, you know, might upset some folks. So they want to make sure only Muslims are going in. There are special hours that people who are not Muslim can enter. So the thing about the Dome of the Rock, two things that are really amazing, is that one, if you look at the city from a distance, it is all beige. The whole city of Jerusalem, New Jerusalem and Old Jerusalem, it's all beige. The most colorful and maybe only colorful thing there is the dome. And you see this from a distance, and there's no way that you can approach the dome over and over and over again and not be stunned. Every time you turn around, it's like, oh my gosh, there it is again. I have to take another picture. But here you can see, we're walking, right here we're walking, this is inside the compound where Aqsa and the dome are. And then up, then you have to, you climb steps to go up. And then there's little areas around there. And so these are all photographs that I've taken. And of course you have to take the mandatory, is that working? The mandatory selfie to prove that you were actually there. No, it's not working. Oh, this is another picture of it at night. I really have like 150 pictures of the dome. I mean, I can't tell you. But one thing we have to remember is the Dome of the Rock is not Al-Aqsa. It's not the mosque that we read about in the Quran. Aqsa is a different masjid. A few photographs from inside. Now, it was really hard, and actually, I don't know, maybe I was just stunned, but I didn't really get many pictures of the dome inside. This is when you enter. Inside, there's a circular formation, and where you see the scaffolding, all that scaffolding goes up all the way to the dome, and at the bottom of it, at the base of it, is the actual rock. The actual rock that we read about in our tradition. With the Prophet ﷺ, during the Isra and Mi'raj, he was ascending to heaven, and the rock was, it is said, ascending with him, and he told the rock to stop so he could ascend to Jannah. This is the inside of the dome. The thing about it, what's interesting about Dome of the Rock Mosque is that it's actually not that big. It's a fairly small space, but it's incredibly intricate, really beautifully decorated. And then there is an entrance so that you can go underneath the rock. And this is that entrance. So you descend, this is the actual rock that the dome is built on top. And then you descend inside. And there's a very small prayer space in there, as you can see. This right here, that photograph is taken right next to the stairwell. You can see the stair sides over there. And this is while I was praying. Now, is there anything interesting you notice about this picture? Anything that jumps out at you? Right. So every mosque I prayed in the Holy City, and I prayed in many different mosques, there were like no barriers. I think there was only one mosque in which there was a barrier for women, and that was in the new portion. So it was Masjid al-Umar, where when Hazrat Umar was the Khalifa, he entered Jerusalem. And a mosque was built where he prayed. But in the old portion where he actually prayed, there's no barriers for the women. There's a new portion where they built a barrier. But in every other mosque, whether it's the dome, whether it's Aqsa, there's no partitions for women. Now here, obviously, these are people who are just praying, maybe nawafil or sunnah, they're not praying in congregation. When we did pray in congregation, people would separate, naturally, but there was no barrier, so. These are some photographs from outside of the dome. There's some beautiful old structures, like this. What's it called? It's called a mihrab, where people get the khutbah from. And this gentleman resting under the shade. It was interesting because I saw every single day, even in that incredible stifling heat, a lot of elderly people walk into and out of the compound. And it's even for people who are young, it was exhausting. It would take us an hour to get from the new city into the mall. It would take at least an hour to get through that and fight the heat and get beyond the bazaars and the courtyard and finally into the compound. And these elderly folks were all day in and out, and I thought that was amazing. This is Al-Aqsa. This is the mosque that we read about, the furthest mosque in the Quran. It is very unassuming looking from the outside. It looks very, very simple. But inside, this is just one shot of it. It's incredibly, incredibly ornate. It's stunning. I took some black and whites. It's very open. It's completely open. Again, there's no spaces for men and women separately. You pray wherever you like, except for in congregational prayer. They split them up. So this is an interesting shot. When you leave the compound, again, you are exiting gates. And these are visitors who want to come in and see the dome, and they want to see Aqsa, but because they're not Muslim, the guards won't let them in. And we saw this over and over and over again. So we kind of felt very privileged that we could go in, and other folks were not allowed to be let in, but there were certain very limited hours that they could come and see it. I have some images of inside the old city, meaning inside the bazaars and stuff. This is a picture of a hookah lounge, which, like, they're all over the place. But what's interesting to me is, of course there's no women, right? There's no women sitting there smoking hookah. Now, you go to a shisha lounge in the United States or in the UK, in the West, they're like all over the place now. Women and men do it together. But the Arab culture there is highly, highly patriarchal, I realized. We had one incident where, now our group was a mixed group. There were brothers and sisters, both of us, men and women. But we would go, if we went to go eat to a restaurant or something, we would naturally segregate. It happens. The men would end up at one table, the women at another table. So we wanted to eat kunafa, and if you don't know what kunafa is, you should find out. It's amazing. Amazing Palestinian dessert. We were sitting at a table, us women, and we were laughing about something, and the men were off on their own. And all of a sudden, we heard this loud noise behind us. One of the workers who was going around picking up dishes started slamming the dishes on the table. And he said, stop. I didn't know what he was saying. It was in Arabic, but one of the ladies knew Arabic, and he was saying, stop laughing. We can hear your voice. Stop laughing. I don't want And we were like, coming from a Western context, we're just enjoying a cup of coffee and some dessert and talking and laughing amongst the ladies. So it was very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. And I experienced this many times. I experienced many times from my Arab brothers that they were pretty harsh on us ladies. Now let me just say something. I'm going to end up offending like all kinds of people today by the end of the talk. So if you feel offended, just wait. At some point, somebody else will be offended, and you'll feel better. Other pictures from inside the bazaar. The bazaar is amazing. It just is endless, and there's so many things you want to photograph, but you can't constantly because they're also, people have concerns about who you are and why you're photographing them. So you kind of sometimes have to walk by and do a quick click. But here, food and even lingerie being sold out like this in the streets. The jewelry was amazing. I spent way too much money buying some really beautiful, authentic pieces. And this is like different kinds of fragrances that you burn. I thought this was hilarious. This is a sign on top of, it says, I have good falafel, in case you can't read it. And the falafel and hummus wars are strong and they run deep in that part of the world. So we would ask around before we would go to get falafel and hummus. And after 2 weeks of eating falafel and hummus, I'm telling you, it took me like 6 months before I could eat it again. Like I had it I had it all day. I had it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was ridiculous. This is an image somewhere inside the old city, and you can see that it says the Western Wall. And I was able to go to the Western Wall, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But it was amazing. It was amazing because you're walking in history. There would be signs like, oh, the seventh station, of the cross, right? The seventh station of the cross, like the stations of the cross, and the Immaculate Conception is this way. And it's like, you are a tourist in history. It is. There's absolutely something extremely holy about this place. extremely special about the entire city. But I will say, you know, people are like aesthetically attracted to the Dome of the Rock, but there is something about Aqsa. Like I went to the Dome a couple of times, but over and over again I wanted to return to Al-Aqsa. And most of us, when we had time to go and pray, we always went to Aqsa. There was something really amazing about that place, really spiritual about that place. And behind Aqsa, there's so many little masajid that you just stumble across. We ended up going to the mosque of Salahuddin Ayyubi, which today is a center that they take care of children, like orphans and stuff, and they have a little school there. It's tiny, it's kind of falling to pieces. But what's amazing is the original bars and stuff, the original ironwork is still there, and there are bars in the windows that are made of iron, and they say little inscriptions. It says Allah and Muhammad. It's beautiful, but it's, you know, it's tiny compared to what you think of when you think of the glory of somebody like Saladin. Behind Aqsa, and there were some stables, and I can't remember. I believe it's called the Ayyub Ansari Mosque, and I can't remember this particular masjid. But there were stables apparently that during the time of the Crusaders, they had turned a mosque into stables. When the Muslims reconquered Jerusalem, they turned it back to a mosque. So we descended. We had to go really underground, about 2 levels, to go there. And then in a tiny little corner was the mihrab of Maryam. And it was a place, but we couldn't get in. It was barred, so we looked at it through bars. And I have pictures, but I didn't include them because you can't see. But essentially, it was a little space, tiny space, maybe the size of the quarter of this room. It had a little raised platform, and that is, according to the Islamic tradition, where Maryam used to meditate and reflect, and where Hazrat Zakaria would come and give her food, or she would receive food from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also it was where she received the glad tidings from the angel Gabriel that she was going to have a child. So it was an amazing, haunted, holy place. So people live inside the walls, and there are tiny little tunnels that lead to people's homes, and there's artwork, and you know what part of the old city you're in, depending on the artwork. There are the places that seemed a lot more kind of older and what do you think of was authentic, you know, they were where the Palestinians, the Arabs lived, and then there were certain areas and certain parts of the bazaar where it was mostly Jewish merchants, and I don't know how many Jews actually live inside the old city, though. As you can see, this is a gentleman, he's emerging from his home inside those walls. And what's amazing is, you know, even in that heat, once you hit the old city and you're inside of the labyrinth, it's very cool. The stone keeps it extremely cool. So that was maybe one of the most peaceful places to be. Once you emerge back out, and we would go back to our institute, which was horrible. He was horrible. This is just a picture of a merchant. You did see people, you know, it's you know, the interfaith place to be in the entire world, right? You see people of all and people who are extremely observant Jews, extremely observant Muslims and Christians. But the interaction is a difficult interaction, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. A lot of diversity. There was, you know, some folks who were from Africa, but these were Muslims who were actually visiting Aqsa and were there. We happened to be there for the Isra Miraj, the night of the Isra Miraj, and that was an amazing experience, and I'll tell you about that. So because we were there for that time, a lot of people also had traveled and gotten in. I love this picture because this girl was giving me a lot of attitude, and I tried to take her picture, and the one in the front, she's like, all right, you want to take it? But really cute girls. Some of the, these are some of the t-shirts. Hilarious and tongue-in-cheek, but there's also some pain, right? There's some pain in reality. And you see all kinds of stuff. I mean, very anti-Israel, very anti-Palestinian, you know, you name it, it's there. I didn't buy any of it. I wanted to get out. This little boy, his name is Isaac, and he was our guide inside the old city. And I'm telling you, there was a network, because as soon as we would enter, it could be any time. It could be like late in the night, early in the morning. Somebody would let him know, and he would just show up. Oh, I heard you were at the, you know, Salahuddin Mosque. No, you did not. He's like, he would say, I just had a feeling. No, you didn't. There is some network that's letting you know. So he took us to all the places that we otherwise would not have known. He was like I think he was 10. But he was like a 10-year-old, with the mind of like a 40-year-old, incredibly mature, really active. He would arrange for food to be brought to us. We needed drinks. But at the same time, he was very careful. Like, sister, your hijab's not correct. Fix your hijab. So he ordered us around. And, most of us women who were there were all professionals. There was a couple of lawyers, there were doctors, and I was sitting with one of my friends who was a doctor. And we were just talking to him. I'm like, he's so cute. And I'm like, what do you want to be when you grow up? He's like, I want to be a doctor. And I'm like, oh, well, she's a doctor. And he looked at her and he's like, yeah, and he just walked away. And I'm like, oh, this attitude, man, it's not going to get you anywhere. Okay, is that better? Okay. This is on the night of Isra Mi'raj. It was the most packed that night, and for those of you who are not aware, the tradition is that on this night, the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he ascended to heaven, and it's a very long tradition in the different things that happened during that night, but it's a very auspicious night, and so on this night, we were trying to figure out what should we do? We stayed in Aqsa as long as we could, and we prayed as long as we could. And then we heard that there was a Sufi gathering happening in this one little enclave. So you literally from Aqsa could follow the music all the way to this tiny little. It was an Afghani mosque, and it was packed. And around the perimeter was the space for the women, and it was amazing. It was beautiful. And all night till Tahajjud, they sang nasheeds and they sang hymns and they recited Quran. And it was, I don't know what they gave me to drink. I had some drink there that I wanted to keep going back for. I think it was like a tamarind drink. I don't know, it was beautiful and it was fragrant. And you can see a little bit, but we were under a canopy of grapes. It was just loaded with grapes. It was amazing. Now, the ubiquitous IDF soldier. Now, it was really tricky getting their picture. I had to pretend like I was looking at something else and keep walking, because you can't. They won't let you just stop and take a picture, especially if, for somebody like me who obviously looks like a Muslim, right? Like maybe if I look like a tourist, if I look like a European tourist, but for folks like us, I had to be a little bit careful. But they're everywhere. They're everywhere. Here you can see, we're behind some of the soldiers. Again. And most of them, I have a daughter who's almost 17, so I think a lot of these guys didn't look a whole lot older than my daughter. So I'm like, these are like child soldiers to me. So this was us at the Western Wall, and we happened to go right before, some of you may not be aware, but there's a movement that's ongoing right now in Israel and Jerusalem in particular about women's access to the Western Wall, about the access of Jewish women. I don't know the name of the movement, but basically what's happening is that the ultra-Orthodox men are saying that they want to push this side of the women's wall all the way to the edge and create a new space for them, and they oppose women saying certain prayers because the ultra-Orthodox are saying that you're not allowed to say certain prayers. So the day after we got there was a big tussle and people got arrested, but at least during the time we were there, it was relatively quiet. There was a fence here, and me and all of the other Muslims, the men went to the men's side, the women went to the women's side, we went all the way to the wall. We went to the wall very respectfully. We stood there, we contemplated, and then we were told, to back. When you leave, you don't turn your back. You back away, so we backed away. Nobody bothered us, nobody said anything, and it was very peaceful, it was nice. We didn't stay in Jerusalem the whole time. We did get to go to the West Bank. Now we're going to be going back next year to Gaza, inshallah. That's the plan, is that next summer we go back for 2 weeks and we visit Gaza. And this was kind of the trade-off, as we were having discussions about whether we want to do this program, what we're going to do, what are we going to get out of it, why should we even do it. We said we have to visit the Palestinians in Gaza. And believe me, there's a lot of Palestinians and Arabs living within Israel. We visited an area called the Arab Triangle, which is in Israel. So these are Arabs who are Israeli citizens, and by and far they are living fairly affluent lives. They're doing pretty well. Like politically they have their issues obviously, but economically they seem to be doing pretty well and fairly well established. But as soon as you enter, this is on the other side of the wall, the wall, the big security wall. As soon as you enter the checkpoint, this is the inside of Gaza. And I'm sorry, not Gaza, but West Bank. you immediately see kind of the difference, you know, in the aesthetic even. And I mean, I understand that there is incredible poverty and all these things, but I couldn't help but think, and I think this, when I go to Pakistan and I visit my neighborhoods in Pakistan, pick up the trash. Just pick up the trash in front of your house. Like, you know, I don't know why we let despair affect us so much sometimes that we, even what we have, you know, we fail to take care of it. And I know that's a controversial thing to say, and I just don't care. I think it's true. This is true. Yes?
Could it be that, I mean, one of the things that I've heard is that the municipal services in Israel behind this what they call Israel proper, are so much better than the services in the West Bank. And even in Jerusalem, between East Jerusalem, where Palestinians live, and West Jerusalem. And so there may be, I agree that people should pick up their trash.
Yeah.
But it could be that they don't have the municipal trash services that people on the other side do.
I completely understand that. I'm going to tell you, in a place like Pakistan, there are no municipal services, okay? You are responsible to pay in most places, unless you live in a really fancy enclave. But the idea of just having enough respect for where you live, and ownership and pride, to me means whether or not the municipality picks it up or not, you know, you should take some pride in this. And this would bother me. And it bothers me whenever I go into some other like Muslim countries and I visit them. I'll be honest, my sister lives in the United Kingdom, and she lives in Birmingham. And as soon as we get to Birmingham, I'm like, yep, we are in Muslim territory. You know, I mean, I'm sorry, they just don't take as good care of it. And I think part of it is not feeling ownership. Not feeling ownership, that this is not really ours.
The law of broken windows.
Yeah. So, but we have this, which is the PLO compound in the West Bank. Yeah, I'm sorry, you had a question?
But you say not but even I heard something, Saudi Arabia, they should feel that there's the ownership there because there's nobody fighting over them in that land.
Right.
Still there's trash here.
I don't know what it is. This is a cultural issue. I think all of our imams should give a khutbah about, you know, clean up your streets outside your house. Yeah.
I just want to buttress the point you're making. I don't think it's the duty of the imams. They've stressed it enough. It's something within us that we have the best religion, the religion that talks about cleanliness. But
Right.
Yet we do not follow that.
We don't follow it. I'm glad I'm not the only one who's noticed this. It's probably my first time making a public profession that I'm deeply disturbed by this. That I'm deeply disturbed that in a lot of Muslim majority, where there's a neighborhood, a city, a town, a village, for some reason nobody takes responsibility. But this is a multi-million-dollar compound that was the PLO compound in the West Bank. It's where all the administrative buildings are. It's also where Yasser Arafat is buried, or maybe was buried, because apparently he was recently exhumed and they did more tests on him. It's a controversy in and of itself. And then we visited Jenin. Anybody know anything about Jenin? Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Jenin is one of the hardest hit refugee camps, number one, in the West Bank, but it also is kind of the hotbed of resistance to the occupation there. A lot of suicide bombers have come out of Jenin. There's been and we visited something called the Children's Freedom Theater. It was the most depressing freedom theater I had ever been to. And the gentleman who gave us a presentation, he talked about the theater, he talked about the founder, how it began. That founder himself, and then his mother had begun the program. The founder himself, his father was Palestinian, his mother was a Jew, and he had an amazing story, but he had been assassinated just like 2 years prior to our visit. And you know, there was an incredible sense of despair, and he was talking to us, and in our group we had people who were imams, we had people who were chaplains, we had people who knew the deen. So, you know, he was saying, you know, I have brothers who are in Israeli prisons, I have brothers who have killed themselves in suicide bombings, and if I could get past that wall, I would do the same thing. So there was a deep sense of pain, and you know, the people in our group were like, oh no, you're not allowed, you know, let me tell you about, but this was not about religion for him. He said, I don't care about the Quran, I don't care about religion. This is not about that. This is about the pain of violent occupation, and the only way we know how to resist it. And he was the director of that theater, or he was somehow related to that theater. So the sense of despair runs very, very deep, even for people who are trying to do good work. I mean, you routinely saw, burial sites they had martyr sites, people buried. We actually walked to a portion of the dividing wall, where in the distance, what you see that's also those are settlements that are being built. The settlements, not all the settlements are very fancy, but some of them are quite fancy. And this particular location where we were going had a lot of activity. I think once a week there were activists who gathered there. There were Israeli soldiers on the other side who would like shoot canisters of gas and stuff. As you can see, and activists from all over the world would arrive here and put graffiti on and take part in the solidarity activities. Okay, this is my last slide, and I know it's a really odd slide, but this is the only picture I took inside of the institute where we learned. So I'm going to now tell you about that part of the experience. You've seen kind of the pictures in the tour. Okay. So what you're seeing here is this was an ad hoc, completely unplanned event that we put together. When we arrived at this institute, now this institute is mostly academics and rabbis who then teach other academics and rabbis. They also teach politicians about Judaism. They teach about a third of the schools in Israel get their curriculum. So that's how much influence this particular institute has. They are a very, I would say, kind of moderate institute. And they are completely educational. So it was interesting to us. Now, we're Muslims. We need to pray at least 3 or 4 times a day while we're there, right? We had Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, sometimes even Isha. And they arranged for us to pray. But they told us that in the entire lifetime of this institute, there has never been a prayer held here, ever. Any kind of prayer. We were the first people to ever pray at this Jewish institute. The second thing was, when we prayed in the office of the man who had founded the institute. He died, and he worked a lot on Israel-Palestine issues, and he wanted peace, and he worked towards peace, and he believed in a 2-state solution. He had passed away about a year before we got there, and ever since then, his office had been empty. So we were the first people to use it, and we used it to pray. And I thought that was amazing. I thought it was beautiful. His son now runs the institute. He's a rabbi. And his son held for us the Shabbat service at his home on a Friday evening. We went, we had dinner, we watched the service, him and his wife. And then we prayed Maghrib together in his home, and he joined us. He joined us in the entire prayer. He was in front of me. He made sujood, and he prayed the entire salah with us. And I thought this was astonishing. So this is how they opened their hearts to our group. But this was the most amazing thing to us, that we were the first group of Muslims, or Muslims at all, but most of them said we have ever talked to or interacted with. Most of the rabbis and the scholars and academics said, I've never met a Muslim before. And they were amazed. They're like, wow, you guys are funny, you're smart, the women have they talk a lot, we're not submissive. They were amazed by us. They just did not realize that we could have personalities and be as human as anybody else. And what was painful to see about this was that everybody working in our hotel, in the institute, they're all Palestinians, they're all Arabs, Muslims. But there was a real, almost a tangible barrier between the people, the academics and the people who operated the place and the people who worked there, the labor class. They never spoke to each other. I said, how can you live surrounded by Muslims and never have met a Muslim before? One time we were going to be breaking, it was time to pray and everybody left to make wudu and I was going to join them, and one of the professors, he was sitting there and he's like, can I ask you something? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I don't want to offend you. And I said, okay, it's just me and you. He said, do you guys really pray this much? Because, are you just doing this for show? Or is it because you're all pressuring one another? You feel spread? And I'm like, no, we do. I mean, the ones who observe it do. I mean, so, and he's like, wow, we don't pray this much. And I'm like, you're a rabbi. Okay. So I did learn that a lot of Jews, even rabbis, don't pray that much. And one thing I learned, God, I learned so much. I felt very frustrated the first week, maybe even 10 days, and all of us did. And believe me, we were not the kind of group to sit there and just quietly listen. We constantly challenged, we did not understand things, and we wanted to understand things. Because we spent at least 10 days studying the idea of peoplehood in Judaism, the idea of Zion in Judaism. And honestly, we thought this is propaganda. You are giving us propaganda so that we can then accept, the idea of understand it from your perspective, understand the idea of Zionism and why this was necessary and all these things. But, it took being presented as a lawyer evidence, right? I had to read texts that were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old to understand, and even from, the scriptures themselves to understand that the idea of Zion was not a political idea that began in 1947. It had roots from way before. Now, I also never knew how closely the idea of Zion and peoplehood related to the actual religion. And we kept saying, I want to learn your Aqidah, I want to learn your creed, what is your faith, what are you talking about? Why do you keep talking about Zion? But this is the Aqidah. We were also told that it's not necessary for Jews to believe in an afterlife, that there's no guarantee of heaven and hell. And then we thought, what? What is the point of that? What are you saying? Well, it was explained to us that, our redemption was in returning to Zion. That is why, even hundreds of years ago, people wrote poetry and wrote books and wrote about this, because that was where we were going to, this was going to be our agenda. We learned that, as far as a lot of Jews are concerned, God can be wrong. We did not understand this at all. We're like, what are you talking about? Sometimes God can get it wrong. There was a story, and we joke about this, about, and it's from, so we studied Torah, and we studied Mishnah. We studied in ways that they said most Jews don't even study. It's called Havruta study, where we studied in small groups, and it was very intense and exhausting, but got a lot out of it. And we read a story in that called the story of Rabbi Eliezer. I hope I'm saying it right. And I think, to this day, we can't stop talking about the story. In the story, this rabbi is with a group of rabbis, and he says to them, God has spoken to me, and I hear something, and he's telling me, and I can't remember the details, but basically God is telling me something, we have to do X. And the other rabbis say, well, no, we have the Torah, we don't care if God's talking to you. God gave us the Torah, now God can step aside and let us do what we need to do. Let us make the decision. And we were like, oh my God, what are you saying? Make God step aside. It was completely flipped the idea of our relationship. What is our relationship to God versus the relationship? And, apparently, Israel means the one who I think wrestles with God. And they wrestle with God. And it's an interesting relationship they have that's outside of the understanding of the Islamic faith. About the conflict, getting to some of the meat and potatoes. Over and over again, we did raise this issue. And they were wholly unprepared for this issue. And the truth is, this was not just an experiment for us, it was an experiment for them. This is the first time they were going to do this. And when the program got developed, it took 2 years to put to play. They lost members from the board, they lost donors. There were people who were like, no, we don't want to do this. Why are we going to spend money on Muslims coming here and teaching them anything or even having dialogue? But when we raised the issue, we said, okay, fine. I'm now convinced that even the idea of returning to Zion and the idea of Israel is one that is actually rooted in your faith. How did you consider the people who already live there? What was the framework that you looked at them with? Was it that they're just kind of there temporarily? They didn't really belong there. We have to get rid of them. We have to absorb them. And we could never get that question answered. But because we raised it a million times, and actually we just met in New York again 2 weeks ago, we're gonna spend 3 or 4 days examining that when we go back to Israel, because we have to understand this. For many of us, even now when we talk, they feel very conflicted. They feel very conflicted that we're sitting here, we're listening to one side of the story, and we're not getting the other side of the story. Although the truth is, we know the other side of the story. That's been our story this entire time. But we actually had the chance to spend a day with an Israeli who was the lead Israeli negotiator in the Palestinian and Israeli talks, I think for about 10, 15 years. And he posed the question, okay, what do you think the conflict is? Who is the conflict between? So I'm going to pose this question to you. Who do you think the conflict is between? What are the two? Yes?
Well, you have basically somebody who came from Europe, people who came from Europe, imposing their ideas, their norms upon the natives who were there. It's like in the United States, when the Europeans came, Christopher Columbus, they imposed their culture, their idea, their religion upon those natives. And today we have the United States of America. So there's
Okay, so but if you were to frame this Mideast conflict, it's X versus Y. Who are the X and Y? Yes.
I would say the conflict is between hardliners and moderates,
Hardliners and moderates within
both sides.
both societies. Okay, anybody else? Yes.
I think the conflict, there are many conflicts. That may be one, but I think the main conflict historically was between Jewish and Arab nationalists in Palestine.
Okay, Jewish and Arab now. Today, what is the conflict today? Who are the two parties? How do you look at this frame, this conflict?
They've become two countries, so now it's the two states.
Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead. Palestinians and Israelis, right? And you, what were you gonna say?
Most of the conflict that I see is either civilians in army or whoever they are.
Palestinian civilians and the IDF, right?
Yeah,
And
are they troops or army or police?
they're army. It's required. Every Israeli citizen, I think at 16 or 17, they have to serve 2 years in the IDF. So for the most part, as a Muslim, yeah.
I'll give you one. People who want peace and people who want some ideal, whether it's justice or God's will or something like that.
Right. That's a really interesting thing, and then I'll actually comment about that. And this is a story that that particular negotiator shared with us. But basically, he said, when he asked us the question, most of us said it's Israel versus Palestinians, and he said, well, Israelis look at it as Israelis versus the Arab world, and then somebody said, well, no, okay, maybe it's the Arab world versus Israel and America. So, we're constantly, so depending on where you are on that, like where you think, you're David and you're Goliath, it depends on how you're looking at this, right? Who's your David and who's your Goliath? And who ultimately has power here. So one thing that was interesting, so these negotiators, he shared with us that you end up negotiating the same people. You're seeing the same people year after year after year after year. They get to know each other. He said, but there was such incredible distrust that sometimes what would happen is that one side would bring together a proposal, the other side would say, okay, we accept it. And the first side would say, wait a minute, if they accepted it, something's wrong with it. So we're gonna go back and we're gonna take, we're gonna renegotiate. And so this incredible, and also what is just. And that's another thing, within Israeli society, we got to meet members of the Knesset, we got to meet settlers. We had a settler come in, an older gentleman, and you could feel we might have been the first Muslims he actually spoke to, in a room around a table. You could feel his incredible anger, and I think it was anger based in fear. And he ended up actually calling us all. He said, "You're all potential terrorists." So that was a hard night. We had a tough night that night. But we also met people who were activists, who were doing amazing, amazing humanitarian work for Palestinians and with Palestinians, and these are also Israeli Jews. So the spectrum in the Israeli society is incredible in that tiny country in terms of, yes?
There's also a movement among Israeli soldiers called Breaking the Silence.
Sure, yeah.
And the Refusnik movement. And these are soldiers who are breaking the code of silence and telling about some of the very difficult and really bad things that they are forced to do during the course of their service in the West Bank and in Gaza,
right,
and at the checkpoints. And then movement of some of the members of the very elite troops where they are refusing to serve.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a refusnik movement where people are either refusing to serve in the IDF outright, or having served and they become kind of proponents for the Palestinian cause.
And I also know about a movement called the Sheikh Jarrah movement, which actually gets together Israelis and Palestinians to work against any kind of injustice which is being done to Palestinians. For example, some of these people joining the Sheikh Jarrah movement have worked together to fight any form of injustice, like deposing some of the Palestinians out of their homes or forcing them to leave their land or their homes and so on. And I showed this to my students in my Arab media class at Maryland, and they're like, "Whoa, we did not even know about that." And I think a big part of this is because the media, unfortunately, has been following the principle of when it bleeds, it leads, and always showing conflict and confrontation, not really showing good examples of coexistence, reconciliation, and peace.
We completely lack nuance in our understanding of this issue. And most of us, I did not grow up knowing that, much of the activism for justice for Palestinians is coming from Israelis and Jews. I didn't grow up
And
knowing
the
that.
Sheikh Jarrah movement was started The Sheikh Jarrah movement was started by a young Israeli Jewish woman.
That's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, so, what happened here, so I'm going to get back to this picture now, was that after we had been there for about a week, the scholars and the academics and the rabbis and even the students, they were so excited about our group, and apparently they're still talking about us, that they said, we don't know anything about Islam. Forget Muslims, we don't know anything about Islam. So we put an ad hoc panel together. These are a lot of the scholars that have worked for that institute who come, and we had 4 or 5 people on the panel to address their questions about being a Muslim, about Islam, about the experience of being a Muslim in the West. And one amazing thing that's come out of this is that there is now a movement towards creating, so we are part of something called the Muslim Leadership Institute. That's what they've called this program. But we are now creating a Jewish Leadership Institute in which we are going to be taking about 25 of their scholars and rabbis and taking them maybe to Turkey or somewhere else to learn about Islam and Muslims. And I think that's like the most profound lesson that's come out of this for me, is that what we find is that people who are some of the best positioned, and we're talking here, this is again an institute that is relatively progressive, it's fairly moderate in its political views, if you look at some of the writings of the people attached to it, and they even are completely disconnected from Muslims and Islam and the Muslim experience and the Palestinian experience. So bringing them that far, just through their interaction with a bunch of goofballs, because we had some goofballs in our group, to me is maybe one of the most amazing things. We're still struggling. We don't know where this is going to go, how this is going to go, but I think and again, this is an institute that puts the curriculum out for 1/3 of Israeli schools. So there's amazing potential for something to be done here. But I think it's funny because it kind of reflects what we find even in America. When you talk about the statistics on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, most Americans say they don't know Muslim. It's all it comes down. It starts there, at least it has to start there. So, a lot of people here, are involved in interfaith work, and I want you to understand that, there were plenty of times when we felt despair. We thought there's just no solution here, But then we realized that we didn't actually examine every way to approach the solution. If you don't even know a Muslim, that's the weird place to start. So, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
I apologize that I wasn't here for the beginning of
Oh, it's
your
okay.
talk. Sorry, and it is an excellent talk, Rabia. It's wonderful and very informative. And so my question is, if you didn't mention this already at the beginning of your talk, are you going to be setting up a website or a blog where all these very fascinating things that you've just told us here, where you're going to put them in writing, maybe with some of the photographs, so that people can access this information?
So when we
Or on the Institute's website, perhaps?
So the mutual decision was made when we were there as a group with folks from the Institute and also people involved in our work in the actual group. It was that we were going to observe a media blackout for now, until we kind of saw where this went. I'm telling you, to this day there are people who are like, I'm in it, I don't know why I'm in it. I never had an issue with, I had no conflicts in my mind about why I wanted to do this. But I'm also somebody who works with federal organizations that other Muslims say don't work with them, but I figure if you don't work with them, you're not going to get anywhere. So because of that media blackout, and that's also the way I made my presentation, was to make sure I don't name any names. Many of the Muslims who were involved were people that everybody knows, they're household names, and it could affect the credibility of their work. And everybody needs to decide what they want to do with this information. So for me, I think this is my first time I've spoken about it. I've never written about it. I think my next step is that I'm going to write about it. But we're like halfway through the program. So today I'm actually missing one of my online classes for this course on some rabbinic text. It's an ongoing program. I go back again 2 weeks in the summer, and I don't know. So I'm going to start writing about it, but again, I have to be very careful about it. We can't even name the institute for different reasons, right? I mean, politically, it's very hard for them. If we say, look, we prayed there 5 times a day, it could pose a lot of problems for them from hardliners within Israel. I'm going to take some questions, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, that gentleman first in the back. Glasses?
Yeah, just to the best of your knowledge, because you probably don't understand, is what exactly is Zion?
Zion. So, yeah. So what I learned was, actually maybe it's better if one of our Jewish friends who's here could explain. Ira, would you like to address that?
No.
Can you explain? Oh, yeah.
Byron Van.
Yes, definitely. Explain Zion, the idea of Zion.
Well, let me set it up a little bit. You made the statement, Rabia made the statement earlier, Jews believe in X, and the return to Zion was our afterlife. But you also said that Jews wrestle with God. So really, that second point is more fundamental. We're wrestling with these ideas all the time, and because of that, different Jews believe different things, and that's fundamental. They always say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. That said, one of the main things that does connect us is the belief in the sense of a homeland where we will return to where we came from, before we came from Europe. And in this country, most Jews are European. In that country, and maybe before the Russian Jews came in, most Jews were from that area, from the Middle East. And originally we connect ourselves, just as you talked about what Muhammad did in rising up, and I read the Quran, we talk about coming from that area and then being thrown out by others. So the return to Zion, to the land of Israel, is the return to our homeland. And if I can make sort of one point, I think that peace sort of lies in each side appreciating the other's deepest narratives. And my Palestinian friends have taught me that we Jews must feel not only their pain, but the injustice that has been done to them as individuals and as a people, and deal with that in our actions. But I say there's a flip side. And the flip side is that our Arab and our Muslim cousins, I use the word cousins, a coordinator of Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society, we're first cousins. Our cousins must appreciate our Zionism and what that means to us, this whole movement of returning and having a place for ourselves that, where we don't get slaughtered like we did in Germany. And so we've heard a lot about the Jewish diversity of opinions on helping the Palestinians, or some that don't want to, that say you're terrorists. We're all over the map. To me, peace will be advanced so much when Jews start hearing about Palestinians and Muslims who are Zionists, who are saying the Jews deserve their piece of earth just like we do. And that's called the two-state solution. But when we start hearing more of that from the Palestinians, peace will be so much more at hand.
The interesting thing about that, I think in private conversations you'll hear it. But publicly, it's really
that's what I'm talking about.
expensive
Publicly.
to say. Yeah, it's hard to say that. At the same time, let me also say, what we learned about and I don't know if the Orthodox or the Hasidic Jews, but the group of Jews who live in Israel, who believe very strongly that we are in exile, we are not supposed to return to the land of Israel and Zion, but they still live there and they actually, benefit from them, and they don't have to join the IDF, they benefit from. There's a lot of contradictions in that society.
If I was just to build on what Dan was just saying now, I think it's very important to gain some sort of empathy to the other side.
Absolutely.
Based on knowledge and awareness and acknowledging the suffering of the other side. Because it's no secret that in many parts of the Arab Muslim world, there's this notion of the Holocaust, for example, being a form of propaganda, right? And I think it's an attempt to insulate yourself from being empathetic to the other side. And the same could be said about, don't talk about the Nakba, for example, or the Palestinian suffering. I think the importance of acknowledging the suffering of the other side, awareness, knowledge, understanding, and empathy are essential for any kind of reconciliation or true peace building. Which leads me to my question to you, Rabia. After this fascinating visit, which I'm jealous about, I would love to be able to do such a similar trip if I can, and we'll talk about this later if I can take part in a similar effort. Are your hopes personally about peace in the Middle East and reaching some kind of peaceful resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, has this hope increased after your visit or not?
It's increased because I believe our relationship with this institute, which has just begun, can really dramatically affect some of the public discourse and understanding on both sides of the issue. And I believe that's very fundamentally important, just like you said. We need Muslim ambassadors to go into Muslim communities and tell them this is what is going on. You have to listen with an open mind. You have to understand the narrative. And I came away from this thinking, it's true, there are 47 Muslim majority countries in the world. Jews should have their own homeland as well. However, you cannot ignore the issue of, displaced people, dispossessed people. And then I say, and this is something that I feel, as somebody who's been kind of an activist in my life, is that I have to remember also the land that I'm living in. This land was not an open, free land that we just came and take, This land was also built on the backs of slaves, and it was taken away from other people who, to this day, are living in reservations in really, really horrible, horrible conditions, So none of us have clean hands, is what I'm saying, We benefit from this state, and this state is not a bloodless state.
Thank you, Brian. According to what I heard and all negotiation, because we are not looking for peace, we're looking for security only. So
Security is the main concern?
No, security, not peace. Peace, you're going to stop them, but with the security, they can grab more land, but still in safe. This is the main thing.
I mean, the complication here is that in order for peace, you have to have security. That's in every society, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Palestine, in territories that's controlled by Palestinians. Anywhere you want to have peace, you have to start with security.
Now with the negotiation, you still want to grab more land, more land.
So the difficulty there that I was that I understood going away from that was that a lot of times, and it happens in this country, in other countries, that politicians become hostages to extreme people with extreme religious views and extreme political views. So in general, what's happening with the settlers movement is you have people who say that I have a God-given right. God gave us this right to this land, Judea and Samara, and they will not even call it occupied territories of Palestine. So they have such power, they will fight the IDF, they will fight the soldiers, that even for most Israelis who are secular Jews, by and large, outside of Jerusalem, mostly secular Jews, you find a lot of religious Jews